Hello and welcome to episode 2 of TE Present Teacher by Things Education, where we speak about the cutting edge ideas in education in a way that is understandable by all educators and accessible by them and is implementable in the classrooms. I am your host Aniruddh, and today we speak about a very foundational aspect of teaching, which is what are learning outcomes and how do we make learning outcomes decently good. And for that, we have today Ritu. Hi, Ritu.
Hi.
So, we're going to talk about a very basic aspect of lesson planning, teaching, making sure that the students are learning. Uh, I think the first step is then, what are they supposed to learn? And I think learning outcomes is at the bedrock of that. So, yeah, I just wanted to get you in right away and start talking about the importance of learning outcomes.
Right. So, as a teacher, I've taught for very, very long. I've taught both students and I've worked with teachers, and I've seen a stark difference in how I plan and how I approach lessons when I have a clear learning outcome versus when I just know the general topic. I know what I'm going to do, but I'm not very clear on what the learning outcome is. And this is true for many, many teachers that we've worked with, that they see that as soon as they know what exactly they want their students to walk away with, which is what essentially a learning outcome is, their teaching becomes a lot more focused. And the NEP has also now asked for teachers to plan keeping their learning outcomes in mind. There are lots of benefits of learning outcomes, and I think as we go deeper into this conversation, we can talk about specific advantages and features.
Right. And I think from our conversation from the first episode, where we were talking about if we have the learning outcomes in front of us, it becomes easier to understand whether the students have gotten it or not. Assessments become easier, checks for understanding become easier. So, yeah, I'm just trying to recall some of the things that we did speak about a few days ago. And yeah, maybe we can get into a little bit of detail of that as well. So, what I hear you say when you were talking about learning outcomes, a lot of times you are talking about the student. At the same time, the learning outcomes, etc., are written by the teacher or or from a teaching point of view. So let's just quickly deep dive into that aspect of it first. When I'm writing a learning outcome as a teacher, is it what I'm going to go and teach, or is it focused on the students like you are trying? I mean, I guess it came intuitively to you, but yeah, is that something that I've caught on to?
Yeah, in fact, it forms a very important feature of a learning outcome, who it's focused on. Um, And the answer is in the term itself, right? It's a learning outcome. It's not a teaching objective. It's a learning outcome that we want our students to walk away with or our students to be better at. Um, so when we write learning outcomes, we have to be very sure that we're focusing on what students will learn and not what we as a teacher want to do in the classroom. Um, yeah, in the crux of it is that.
Okay. So I get that. So how do I word it? So I don't say that I will go and do something in the class as a teacher. So how do I do that?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question because it's very easy to say, yeah, focus on the student, don't focus on the teacher. But how do you practically do that? That's what's the most important part of the process. So I'll take an example of I'll take a couple of examples of what we've seen with teachers. Uh, for example, there was a teacher that there were a group of teachers that we worked with in primary grades, and they were EVS, science, social science, a mix of those. Um, those are the subjects that they were teaching, and one thing that really stands out to me in my memory is when they wrote in their lesson planning book, they wrote that we want to teach students about plant growth.
Okay.
And that was written as the learning outcome. And the feedback that we gave them there is that, like we discussed, this is very focused on what the teacher wants to do. I want to go in and teach about plant growth, but it's not focused on what the student will learn. If you want to convert it into a learning outcome, which is student focused, one of the easiest ways and one of the most commonly used ways of doing this is starting your learning outcome with the term, students will be able to, or simply students will. So in this case, the learning outcome would then be written as students will mm, do something uh, around plant growth. Um, Students will be able to draw the stages of plant growth, or students will be able to describe the stages of plant growth. So now it becomes about what the students will be able to do.
Right. And for the way you're phrasing it is you're actually talking about the end goal there. So you're not talking about uh, the process of learning, but where the student will actually end up is something that I'm also getting from what you're saying. That it's not just so the student will be able to do something at the end of this lesson, or will be able to differentiate between something, will be able to understand something, will be able to recall something, but the student will be able to do that essentially. Is that how to
Yes.
look at
Yes.
Great. So what I'll do is I'll put it down as a feature, or in my head, I'm putting it down as a feature that the learning outcomes must be student focused. And the easiest way of making them student focused, consciously, is to start the learning outcome with the phrase students will be able to or students will. Is that
Right.
fair? So great. I'm liking this approach that you've taken already. So I'm going to double down on that and say that, okay, if this is one of the features, what is another feature of, say, a good learning outcome?
Right. We sort of already discussed, I've included it in the learning outcome that I just told you about. But the second very important feature of learning outcomes is that they should have very concrete, observable, measurable behaviors that we want to see students display in the classroom. Otherwise, there's no way of knowing if students have actually met that learning outcome. Um, it shouldn't be vague, is what I'm trying to say. It needs to be very explicit, very clear what we want to be able to see students doing.
Wait. Oh, okay. This again reminds me of our previous episode where you're saying that first learning outcomes have to be clear, and the next step after that was how do I know whether the learning outcomes have been met or not? And this kind of
Mhm.
very nicely connects back to that, where my learning outcome needs to be clear enough that I can actually measure or get a check if the students have understood or whatever it is. Like, so how do we do that? I mean, okay, I understand that it should be clear, it should be explicit, it should be measurable, observable. I know you use these words, but how do we do that?
Right. So, again, a trap that a lot of teachers fall into is simply starting a learning outcome if they've already made it student focused. Uh, Always using the word understand in their learning outcome. Students will understand, or students will be able to understand about plant growth, or students will be able to understand the rules of the present continuous tense. Um, Similar, very vague terms are comprehend or they'll know. Um, these are all things, these are all verbs that refer to what is happening in a student's mind. And you'll never be able to, if that's your learning outcome, you'll never be able to see if they've actually understood uh, that concept or learned what they've had to learn. Mm, And so, including in your learning outcome, you want your students to display in terms of a concrete behavior is very crucial. So again, if I go back to that example that I shared earlier, if we simply said students will be able to understand the stages of plant growth, that's vague. I can ask my students, did you understand? And yes, we understood, and that's it. I mean, and that's what ends up happening very often in class, right? Did you understand? Yes, miss, and that's done. But if we want to really be able to see if students have understood the stages of plant growth, one of the easiest ways is to get them to either draw the stages of plant growth after we've gone through that lesson. And I'll be able to see as a teacher if you've actually understood it. Another verb that comes to mind again, like I said earlier, was describe. If students are able to describe either orally or in written form what the different stages of plant growth are, that's a great observable, measurable way of seeing if they've actually met the learning outcome. Similarly, I mentioned tenses earlier, and if in grades 5 or 6 you're teaching your students about, say, the continuous tense, it's not enough to just say my students understand what the continuous tense is, because even within that, will they be able to explain the rules of convert a verb into the continuous tense, or will they be able to write a sentence? Will they be able to write a question in the present continuous tense? There are very different things that they should be able to do, and having measurable, observable objectives there as well, verbs there as well, is going to help a lot in ensuring that they're meeting that learning outcome.
Right. So I hear you say two things, or at least this is what I got from what you're saying, that one, the verb that we are using shouldn't be something that is invisible to a teacher. Whether a student has understood or not is invisible to the teacher, unless it is made visible by either drawing the stages of growth, or describing the stage of growth, or just even recalling and mentioning the stages of growth. So something that makes essentially student thinking visible. Again, goes back to another great book that I'm sure both you have also read this, um, by the Zero Project at Harvard. I don't know. So yeah, which
Project Zero.
basically talks about strategies to make student thinking visible. So yeah, so that's I think one aspect to it. I think the other aspect, which was probably a little more subtle, is that when you say something like understand or knows, it seems to be slightly at a higher level than a broken down thing of what does understanding or knowing something entail. It entails that they can describe, they can recall, they can do these three, four different things. So is that a good way of summarizing what you're saying, that there are two aspects to this?
Yeah, definitely. And I would go a step further and say that understanding is more of an internal thing, but we want students to be able to externalize what they're understanding in different ways so teachers can see it. And in no way are we saying that if the learning outcome doesn't include that term, it won't lead to student learning. Some students may still learn and understand, but are we able to see it? Are we able to actually see evidence of it? Is also important.
Right, absolutely. Makes sense. So two things so far. One, make the learning outcomes student focused. And second, make it make the learning outcome, I mean, have a verb which makes student thinking or understanding visible to you in the classroom. Okay,
Yeah.
great. I think that's a great start. But like I said, I like the structure and I'm going to push through with it, and tell me if you want the change in structure. Okay, if there's some other point that you're trying to make and I'm just forcing it into the structure. Um, okay, so what is another feature that I would, so okay, so I have a learning outcome that is student focused. I have a learning outcome that is going to give me some great measurable way of checking whether the student is there or not. Okay, what else do I need to do?
Okay, so I'm going to actually flip this question around to you, because you're the expert in this particular area. So, say you're talking to teachers in grade 2 or grade 3, and they tell you that, oh, we want our students to be able to explain uh, plant explain about plants, explain to us about plants. Um, Plants is a huge topic, right? Even at that age. So what are some different topics, subtopics that students learn about in grades 2 and 3, according to you?
First thing, what are the parts of a plant? Let's just focus on that. And let's figure out, let's familiarize ourselves with what a plant is. And maybe that is on one side. And the other side of the spectrum would be what are different kinds of plants? Like there are trees, shrubs, herbs, aquatic plants, whatever. So, you're covering a decent spectrum of, okay, do I know what a representative plant looks like? And on the other hand, that, hey, there is variety in plants. You can't just say plants. So, exactly getting down to that question that you asked. Yeah.
Right. And then students also learn about stages of plant growth, like we've been talking about. They learn about what they need, what plants need to be able to grow to some extent. So there's a lot within just that topic of plants. And if we simply say that we want our students to be able to explain plants, that's too vague. And what that ends up doing is that if we look at a textbook, we'll see that plants have been in any textbook. say a grade 3 textbook about plants. Plants have been defined, parts of plants have been covered in some sort of diagram. Even if it's prior knowledge that students already have, it's recapped in the textbook. If a teacher doesn't know what exactly to focus on within that topic, a lot of time is spent on aspects of that topic that may not actually need to be the focus on that day. Maybe you just need to recap parts of a plant. Maybe you just need to recap requirements of a plant to grow. And the focus needs to be on types of plants today or on stages of plant growth today. Um, so knowing exactly what the learning outcome is, what students need to walk away with, helps you focus on what to do in that class today in order to get students there. And so the feature of the learning outcome that I'm talking about here is that your learning outcome needs to be very clear and very explicit about what specifically, what conceptually you want your students to walk away with in a very specific way.
Okay. I think I get it, and I'm going to try and paraphrase what you said, and you can tell me if I've understood this or not. There are lots of things that need to be covered or can be covered when you're talking about, say, a general topic like plant. Even within plant growth, there are multiple things that you can talk about. What you want is to focus on the specific, whether it's conceptual or, I mean, all knowledge, I think, is conceptual, to be honest. So basically, you're trying to focus on a particular knowledge bit that the students need to get or take away, or a skill that they need to have. I mean, if I think of it from the other example that you use from language, being able to identify the verbs that signify present continuous tense is a skill, which is based on some amount of knowledge, but it's either a skill or a knowledge that you're trying to focus on. Is that how I should see it?
Yeah. I mean, in this case, we were talking about knowledge. In the case of the grammar example, they're all skills, right? Whether I want to be able to convert a just write a sentence in the present continuous tense, write a question in in the present continuous tense, convert a sentence to a question, or write a negative sentence in present continuous. All of these are different skills. Now, again, if a teacher doesn't come into the class focused on uh, specifics of these, students are going to get very confused, because if you have a bunch of different types of sentence, you have negative, you have affirmative, you have questions, and the teacher is not prepared with the rules of these different types of sentences in present continuous, teaching it itself is going to become really difficult. So knowing in your learning outcome or your learning outcomes for the lesson, you can have 3 or 4 learning outcomes which deal with each of these separately. That's going to help the teacher a lot. And of course, it's going to lead to better student learning.
Right. And I know you said that the teacher it becomes easier for the teacher to teach it. In my experience, what has happened is the teacher sometimes doesn't realize that it's easy for me to teach it because I've been doing it for such a long time, and I know this. It might get a little confusing for students if you're using two different kinds of sentences, like a negative sentence and a statement or a question. And if you focus that, okay, I'm going to focus the first 10 minutes on just questions or interrogative sentences. What are they called? I don't know. So questions. And I'm sorry, I'm so bad with this English grammar thing that when you said a question in present continuous, I actually made up a question in my head to understand what that sentence or whatever that thing looks like. So what have you been doing? No, that's also wrong, right? That's what I'm saying. I just don't get it. So, but I get what you're saying
No,
in that break it down into as small chunks as possible and have learning outcomes focused on each of those specific skills. In this case, skills that, okay, being able to write that down in the right form, whether it's an interrogative sentence, whether it's a statement, whatever it is, they should be able to do it for the present continuous tense. So that's, I get that. Okay. So just a quick question on that as well. That one is, okay, it helps students compartmentalize, and it's what we call chunking, that give students information in small bits, and that having learning outcomes which are doing that also probably chunks it for the teacher, that spend 10 minutes in the beginning on interrogative sentences, 10 minutes later for negatives, and then finally on whatever else. I don't know the sequence, but I'm just saying just these. Okay, so as a teacher, what I mean, except for what I said, does that help them in also probably doing understanding whether the students are getting it or not, or making sure that the proficiency in the skill is better or something like that? Okay, I'll try to explain what I'm saying. Um, I can I can understand whether the students in the example that you've given, if I chunk it this way and I have these specific learning outcomes for interrogative sentences, statements, let's just take these two. If the students are doing okay with the statement, but they're not doing okay with the interrogative uh, statements or whatever you want, interrogative sentence, I don't know what to call it. Then it's very clear to me that okay, next class I need to focus only on the interrogative sentence part of it. Um, so that's
Right.
is that also a way of maybe approaching? I mean, thinking about it as a teacher that this is going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you're teaching everything at the same time, you don't know where they're confused, right? And this is what we were talking about earlier, that learning outcomes help you assess your students, identify gaps in their understanding, and then plan for remediation or re-instruction. If I don't know where they're struggling, I will end up reteaching the wrong things or uh, just not knowing what to do, which is the worst case scenario.
Right. Thanks. I think very clarifying. I think now is a good time to take a break. And when we are back, we have a few more features, I hope, on learning outcomes. And then I think we'll go into another question that teachers have a lot when we talk about learning outcomes, and which is the difference between objectives. And this objectives is a slightly vague thing where it's sometimes, in my experience, sometimes it is teaching objectives, sometimes it's just objectives, and other times it's learning objectives. So we'll try and break that down and maybe compare it with or see how it relates to learning outcomes as well. So yeah, let's see you in a bit.
Hi, we have developed an amazing tool to help teachers plan their lessons, TEPS, or Things Education's pedagogical strategies. TEPS helps teachers by reducing the time that they spend on planning lessons. TEPS also helps you if you want to try a different pedagogical approach to teaching. So, if you want to know how to teach a topic in a project-based or inquiry-based or even constructivist learning approach, TEPS is for you. TEPS helps even seasoned teachers with fresh ideas on how to teach specific topics. So, scan the QR code on the screen or visit teps.school and join a community of empowered educators. Great teaching begins with TEPS.
Hi, welcome back. So we were talking about learning outcomes, and we briefly spoke about why they're important. And we have been having this as a thread that why learning outcomes are important through this conversation. At the same time, we've also found out three features of good learning outcomes. One is that it should be student focused. Second is that it should be measurable, observable, something that makes student thinking and understanding visible. And third is that we need to focus on a specific knowledge or skill because it helps us as teachers understand whether the students have reached the learning outcome or not, and it's easier to assess. Okay, so is there another feature, Ritu, which would make my learning outcome good?
Yeah, so I think we'll talk about a feature now that is one of the most difficult features to implement because it's very intuitive to do what teachers are normally doing, which is including in the learning outcome what students will be or the process of learning that they'll be going through. There's a difference between what they'll be showing us as an output or doing as an output versus the process of learning. Let's discuss that with a few examples. Let's go to the example of the plant growth, the learning outcome about the stages of plant growth. Very often, when teachers write the learning outcome, they put in the process of learning, is what we were saying. And so, in this case, a teacher might put into the learning outcome that students will be able to describe the process of plant growth by watching a video, right? And that is for the teacher, that is the process of learning, that we watch a short animated reel, whatever video about how plants grow, which also explains to them what the different stages are. And that's how my students will learn. And that's how they'll be able to describe those stages by the end of it. But there are a few concerns that there are a few issues that come up when we take this approach. But I'll wait for you to maybe just absorb this, ask me some questions, and then we can move on with this.
Right. Okay, so firstly, it started off a little abstractly for me, where we're talking about what students are doing while they're learning versus what is the output that we are expecting. But yeah, okay, I get what you're saying with the example that, the students being able to describe something is the output that we are looking for. How they are getting there is another thing altogether. Whether by watching a video or just by, going through a textbook and looking at a diagram of a plant and just, what's it called? Spaced repetition. That, okay, I'm looking at this. Okay, this is root, this is shoot. And it goes on for, 3-4 times. And that's how they now know or can this. Okay, this time it's described, but they describe these things. Okay, so is that how is that what you're saying? That what the process of learning, whether it's watching a video or just repeated exposure to the diagram or a picture, it doesn't matter in the learning outcome, and you're actually just focused on whether the student has ended up there or.
Exactly. I'm not saying that it doesn't matter in the learning outcome. What I'd say is that it actually detracts from the learning outcome if we include the process of learning within it. What happens is that if a teacher sees that students have to learn about the stages of, they have to be able to describe the stages of plant growth after watching a video, because now it's front and center that they have to watch a video. A lot of the teachers' focus then goes into implementing that or making students are all sitting quietly and watching the video, or the logistics around that. Say that the projector doesn't work, there are technological issues. The teacher's focus is so greatly on the fact that students have to watch the video because that's a part of the learning outcome, that doing it in another way is not really thought about. But if we keep our focus on the student learning, in that moment, then the teacher can think about, okay, let's actually just go out and look at different plants in different stages, if we can find any, or let's just look at our textbook and discuss this. So the focus needs to be on what the students will learn at the end of it and not the process of learning, because it may actively detract from what the students have to learn.
Right. So you spoke about it from a operational point of view that if a video doesn't work, I would also think of it. I mean, right now I'm just focused on a teacher's point of view here, where some teachers may like to take the students out, like you said, into the garden, into the just go out in the playing field and see what are the different plants. You see a grass, you see a tree. What is I mean, that's what I would like my students to do. Let's go out in the field, look at a grass, look at a tree. We call them both plants. What is similar among them? What is different? And then, kind of boil it down to how would you go about describing a plant? What are the different parts of the plant that you saw, etc., etc. Whereas someone else might want it to be a video, or it could just be that, okay, I'm great. A teacher can be great at drawing. They might just want to draw out a plant on the whiteboard or blackboard. So I get the point that it also is a personal thing for a teacher as to what they are most comfortable with. And when I was thinking about it, for me, it was that not only is this comfortable for me, but this is the way I would have liked to learn as well. I wouldn't have wanted to, I had a teacher who was great at drawing, a biology teacher who was great at drawing, and she would only make diagrams. And for me, it was like, okay, it's a great diagram. It's artistically and aesthetically good, but it never captured my imagination. Says a person who has done a PhD in biology, but okay. It didn't capture my imagination there. But so I get it. So it's also to do with the teacher and what they want. But exactly using the same example, I'm going to flip it a little and say that it also depends on what students want, right? I mean, after all, all our teaching is focused on student learning and student learning outcomes. So that would, I mean, in my head, that would also make this point very important, where I don't specify the process of learning, because some students might learn in different ways, and that's the teacher's job to kind of figure out who learns how.
Yeah, I mean, some students might need a little more hands-on experience. Some students might learn better if they follow that up with a little bit of deeper reading, looking at an encyclopedia. So while I understand that, I mean, we all know that in an Indian classroom with such large numbers of students and so much syllabus to complete, uh, making it that differentiated is difficult. But uh, making it too standard for everyone is also not helpful. So if a teacher is able to at least bring in different resources that are available to the students, and by the end of it ensuring that they are able to describe those stages of plant growth, that's the point. But sort of getting stuck in one way of doing it is what is not the point of a learning outcome. And so the learning outcome should not include the process of learning, because that can change.
Okay. So essentially, the learning outcome should be students will be able to describe the parts of the plant, full stop, and not students will be able to describe parts of the plant by listing them or by drawing them or by whatever. Like the process of that is not important.
No,
Is
but
that
that is still the output, right? If they're drawing it and they're listing it, if students are doing that, that's still the output. The focus here is, what we're trying to say is that we shouldn't include the process of learning. What goes in before the students list or draw, that's what should be left out of the learning outcome.
okay? So then the part where you said right at the beginning that students will be able to do this or describe different parts of the plant because they've seen a video or because they have done whatever else, that need not be part of it. Now, I might want to change my learning outcome slightly from students will be able to describe the different parts of the plant by listing the different parts of the plant into students will be able to list the different parts of the plant. I mean, that'll just make it simpler, right? And then break it down
Yeah.
to saying that, okay, students will be able to describe the listed parts of the plant as a second learning outcome or something. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I get the nuance of this. I think I get the nuance of this. Let me put it that way. But yeah, I think that this is something that I think in our experience also it has been a little bit of a contentious point with teachers, because this exactly this dichotomy of the process of learning versus how I'm looking at the evidence of the output, that becomes a slightly slight a point of slight confusion amongst not just I mean not just young educators, but we have seen this with a lot of the more experienced educators as well. And I think this is a good time to just say this out loud that, hey, a lot of these things that we're talking about is coming from the experiences that we've had in the last few years, talking to hundreds and thousands of educators. May not be representative in any way. Maybe actually. But I hope that this is kind of the experiences that you're having, and these videos are actually helping um, clarify some of these things. Okay, so having said that, just to reiterate, now we've done 4 features. Are there any more specific features that we can keep in mind while we are talking about learning outcomes?
I think these four are a good starting point. If we manage to meet these four, our learning outcome will be pretty strong. But would love to hear any other features that you think are important to include.
I think there's a good starting point. We can go deeper into these points, or have more nuanced points coming in within these broader, larger points. I think it's a good place to pause, where now I want to kind of step back a little and say that, okay, these are the 4 features. This is what learning outcomes are. But I am going to ask the question that I have been asked in every session that I have done for learning outcomes is, how is it different from objectives? And I'm saying objectives as a placeholder here, but the phrase is either just objectives or teaching objectives or learning objectives, and they are used interchangeably. So I'm going to ask you, is there, I mean, there's something that I have experienced, and I'm sure you have also experienced some of these conversations with the teachers. How do we compare and contrast between objectives and learning outcomes?
So, I mean, yeah, that's right. That very often we come up against learning objectives in school documents or policy documents. And when we go in and we speak to teachers about making learning outcomes, there's a lot of confusion around the fact that, hey, we already have learning objectives. Why are you asking us to do it again? Um, and and so I think that distinction is very important for teachers to know and understand. And as I understand it, one of the main features of a learning objective is that a learning objective is meant to let the teacher know what they are supposed to what concept or skill they are supposed to focus on. It's not student focused, it's more of a general guideline about these are the objectives that you have to meet as a school, as a classroom. So it's much broader than a learning outcome, whereas a learning outcome is the other end of the spectrum with being extremely focused and extremely specific. So I think that's one of the main differences.
Actually, you kind of implied two there. One is that it's teacher focused or school focused or classroom focused, that, this is generally where we need to go. As in this lesson, this is what we're going to talk about, etc.
Yeah.
And it's guiding the teacher that, hey, let's just focus all of these things into this broadish area. And the second thing that you said was that, yeah, it is a broad area. It's not as granular as a learning outcome. I don't think we can directly test for whether the learning objective has been met. I mean, I'm again trying to use your language now, that it's probably not going to be measurable, observable at a level that, what learning outcomes can be. So yeah, higher level, lesser granularity as compared to learning outcomes. And learning outcomes are focused on students, which was the first point that we made. But objectives are probably more focused on getting the teachers to understand the general topic, subtopic of what needs to be the focus of the lesson. Is that a decent way of putting it? Okay, great. I think that's going to be clarifying, not just for me, for a lot of teachers. And specifically to answer the question, if I already have learning objectives, why do I need learning outcomes? Can you summarize it in 4 features of learning outcomes?
So learning objectives are great. They're important. They give you direction. They give you a broad guideline. What learning outcomes do is help you focus on what students will learn as opposed to what you will do as a teacher. A learning outcome gets you to think about what measurable, observable behaviors your students can display to give you evidence that they have understood and learned. They are extremely specific. Learning outcomes have to be extremely specific. That's how you know what exactly you want to focus on with your students, as opposed to being very broad in that classroom. And finally, it ensures that you're able to personalize your approach in the classroom to what works best for you as a teacher, your skills, and what works best for your group of students in the classroom, by completely removing the process of learning from that learning outcome statement. To zoom out a little bit more, it helps you ensure that students are learning very, very specific skills and knowledge. You're able to assess them a lot better and identify where they are struggling. And finally, you're able to remediate or plan your reinstruction in a very focused manner.
Okay, thanks. I think that's a great summary. And thank you for being here. And thank you so much, Ritu. And thank you all for watching Present Teacher. And if you like the video, please like it, subscribe it, tell your friends, tell your parents, tell everyone about these videos. And yeah, if you have thoughts, um, you agree with whatever we're saying, you disagree with them. More importantly, please share your thoughts. We want to know what you disagree with. We also like to know what you agree with. And yeah, and we'll have more videos coming up in a few days. And signing off now for Things Education and the Present Teacher, I'm Aniruddh. See you.